It's wonderful to be speaking from here. I just wish my wife could see it, because she thinks that this is where I think I should say everything that I have to say. Thank you for bringing me to Nashville to talk about a topic that consistently manages to intrigue, fascinate, and infuriate me, sometimes all on the same day. My new book on the politics of faith in America came out around Labor Day, and since its release, the Democratic Party has recaptured both houses of Congress. Though analysts from all sides of the spectrum immediately set to work trying to figure out whether religiously active voters threw the election one way or the other, I think there was less there than met the eye. Yes, there was a shift among actively church-going Christians to the Democratic column in the midterm elections, but there was a shift in the electorate as a whole, so there's no surprise there. I'll talk later on about the already intense race for the White House. For me, what's interesting is how many Christian conservatives are hanging tough with the president, with the war, and with the Republican Party as so many things have gone sour. And the wider electorate has totally reordered its thinking on the war, the president, the war on terror, whether the war in Iraq has made the country safer, and so on. Though the president's approval rating has declined to the 35% range, much of that 35% is drawn from religious conservatives. There's an intriguing and maybe admirable stubbornness there, which may grow from the same impulses that have so many Christian conservatives seeing themselves as countercultural, swimming against the tide, hanging tough in the face of a hostile American majority, even as more and more Americans describe themselves as Republican, as conservative, as born again, and so on. It may be a stimulating notion to think of yourself as a member of a righteous remnant, a tiny and outmanned group in a sea of decadence. But all the numbers in America have moved smartly on that score for 3 decades. So that's part of something important to keep in mind. The numbers have always been moving in America. Religious and political convictions have never been fixed, static values. And however much sentimental conservatives might want to look backward, big chunks of the American past were not particularly devout eras in our history, though much of the Christian conservative project is a rose-colored look back at a less fallen age, which is imagined not to be burdened with the problems of the present. But that idea doesn't stand up to much scrutiny. At the same time, it does fit neatly with the Christian conservative idea that life in America under a secular government is always getting worse, which is a difficult fit at the same time with the kind of optimism so admired in conservatives like Ronald Reagan. I just got back from Europe, where I was talking to columnists, academics, parliamentarians, and civil servants about the tremendous differences between life in the United States and Europe, especially when it comes to religion in civic life. There was also a stunning level of curiosity among the people I spoke to all week. Curiosity about the upcoming 2008 election cycle. It's a reminder of just how important the vote Americans have, and occasionally even use, is to people who cannot have any part in choosing America's leader. People in countries around the world think it's really important to them who the President of the United States is, but they have to rely on 300 million Americans to pick that person. Recently, when Barack Obama declared his candidacy for president, he walked onto the frigid square in Springfield, Illinois, and said, "Praise and honor to God for bringing us together today." He got an enormous hand when he said that, though I'm not sure who the audience was cheering for. God? Obama? Cheering for themselves for being there when it was 8 degrees on a Saturday morning? Later in his declaration speech, Obama told of his time as a community organizer in Chicago and said that when a child turns to violence, I came to realize that there's a hole in that boy's heart no government could ever fill. It was in these neighborhoods that I received the best education I ever had and where I learned the meaning of my Christian faith. That got attention on the other side of the Atlantic. Listen for Obama in the coming year. He may be the Democrat who mentions his religious commitment most easily and seamlessly in the content of a speech. In Newsweek a few weeks ago, there was an interview with young Hillary Rodham Clinton's youth pastor, who talked about her lifelong commitment to the mission of the Methodist Church. I'm sure it was a total coincidence that it was in Newsweek right around that time. The religious scene in the Republican field is, to say the least, complicated. Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, has been talking about the chance he will run for president and is right now testing out strategies for dealing with the fact that he is in his third marriage and has publicly admitted being an adulterer, that is, having a relationship with the woman who became wife number 3 while he was still married to wife number 2. Is this a deal breaker with those religious elements of the Republican primary vote? John McCain, a senator from Arizona, did not do well among Christian conservatives when he ran for president in 2000, and he wants to do better this time. But he must now make a different kind of appeal to win those voters from the one he's used to build a successful political career. Rudolph Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, is also on his third marriage, and like Newt Gingrich, was already publicly involved with the woman who would become wife number 3, while wife number 2 was still living in the mayor's mansion in New York. He has, throughout his political career, supported the legal right to abortion and the legal rights of homosexuals. For Republicans, it's going to be a complicated fall and then spring of next year. Christian conservative movement leaders are faced with bleak choices between that thrice-married, pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-gun control New Yorker, a Mormon from Massachusetts who used to be pro-gay rights and pro-choice but isn't anymore, a secular politician from Arizona who's right on their issues but has never been a movement guy, a Baptist preacher and governor of Arkansas, and a conservative Catholic from Kansas who's always been good on their issues but has yet to demonstrate that he can attract the kind of national following needed to win the nomination. Just the fact that we know so much about the religious lives of candidates is an illustration of how much has changed in this country in the last half-century. When I was young, and I'm assuming that the way many boomers grew up is not all that different from the way I did, it was thought that those two topics, religion and politics, were the two that would divide people who otherwise thought of themselves as together, as neighbors, as friends, as extended family. And it wasn't considered polite to mess with that presumed unity by bringing up things that might drive us apart. But we think of courtesy in slightly different ways 40 years later, and we think our relationships can stand up to disagreements about these two important parts of our common lives. But those terrible fraternal twins, religion and politics, have gone from being the social unmentionables to something we talk about at the drop of a hat, something we feel no restraint about discussing with intimate friends and complete strangers. It may be part of the talk radioization of American culture, but as those private concerns came out of the conversational closet and as politics has become a basic divider in American life, we've also moved religion, in particular, to a very different place in our common lives. Many of you might know that George W. Bush, the president, is a Methodist. Born and raised in the Episcopal Church of his parents, an adult convert to Methodism. But to what church did Dwight Eisenhower belong? Here he is, a five-star general, one of the architects of the Allied victory in Europe, twice elected President of the United States. Did it come up in daily conversation or stories in the newspaper which church claimed one of the most prominent Americans of the 20th century? Now, it happens that Ike had a very interesting religious history. His parents were members of a branch of the Mennonite Church, the River Brethren. Ike's parents became members of the precursor organization to the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Russellites, or Bible students, when the future president was just a boy. His father then left that church when the prophecies of the end of the world coming in 1914 or 1915 didn't come true. But his mother remained a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses throughout her life. Eisenhower became a Presbyterian in 1952. Now, anyone raised a Jehovah's Witness knows their scriptures pretty well, and it's known that in later life Eisenhower and his brothers rejected many of the teachings of the church, and Ike never mentioned that he was raised a Jehovah's Witness. A prominent advisor told Eisenhower in 1951 that every presidential candidate needs two things: a political party and a church. And at that point, Dwight Eisenhower had neither. As we know, he became a Republican. He only joined the Presbyterian Church shortly before he became president. He was only baptized at National Presbyterian Church, not far from where I live in Washington, after he became President of the United States. Now, you've got to wonder whether a man of such an interesting religious background and no denominational affiliation through much of his adult life could be elected president at all in the frame of mind the country's in now. You have to wonder how and how often it would come up that a candidate for president of the United States, apart from Joe Lieberman, hadn't been baptized. I mean, could you hear it at a news conference? You know, I've been meaning to, and golly, one of the first things I do after I get sworn in, I'm going to make one Sunday to get baptized. I really am. The former governor of Massachusetts may find out in 2008 whether there is a de facto religious test for public office when he checks out the ceiling for Mormons in America's public life. Interestingly, recent poll numbers show more secular Americans would be more willing to vote for a Mormon candidate for high office than those regularly church-attending Christians who self-identify as conservatives. If that's true, Mitt Romney's difficult test is winning the nomination in a primary process in which the voters most likely to reject a Mormon are concentrated in the states where he has to run for their approval. While a de jure religious test is expressly forbidden in the Constitution, there is an informal one. I did dozens of interviews in preparation for writing my book and asked all my subjects, do you think an atheist could be elected president? Every single respondent, left, right, and center, deeply religious to deeply skeptical, said no. There is explicitly no religious test for holding public office in the United States. It's one of the few times the Constitution mentions religion at all. Yet, there is an informal filter. What denomination was Lyndon Johnson, by the way? Anybody know? See? We just didn't talk about it a lot back then. Oh, I'll let you off the hook. Disciples of Christ. Wait till that comes up on Trivial Pursuit. You'll be ready. But was that president's religious faith much of a concern for a country in the middle of a war and a social revolution at home over civil rights? It is frequently declared in the current debates over religion in public life, the separation of church and state, the use of publicly owned land and buildings for religious purposes, that America was founded as a Christian nation. The people who say it in speeches or write it in essays often use that phrase in the full and serene confidence that the listener or reader already knows what that might be. Well, what is a Christian nation? And if you've got that part settled, Is the United States on the list? If the majority of Americans really wanted to aspire to the lofty boast of this being a Christian nation, what obligations, if any, would they have to undertake? Author and Christian layman Bill McKibben notes that the vast majority of Americans believe the adage, "God helps those who help themselves," comes from the Bible. Its actual author was none other than that crusty old skeptic, Benjamin Franklin. Now, maybe you've heard that saying your whole life without really thinking too much about where it comes from. But I think the distinction is crucial. God helps those who help themselves is a very American notion, and one that flies directly in the face of almost everything that Jesus taught. Would being a Christian nation mean finding a way to stop being the wealthy, industrialized nation with the highest rates of murder and violent crime? Would being a Christian nation mean finding a way to climb off the bottom of the league chart of wealthy nations in government giving to the world's poor, as a percentage of GDP, not in gross dollar terms? Both the very secular and the very religious make a key error in looking back at American history. The very secular want to almost erase the impact of religion or ascribe only negative effects to its profound presence in the daily lives of many Americans, while the very religious exaggerate its place in America's founding documents, among its founding fathers, and in charting the course of the country's growth from an insecure archipelago of former colonies to a globe-straddling commercial and military power. I'm not suggesting there's one answer to these questions, just that if we were a Christian nation, those questions might at least get asked. The naive, purposeful mistelling of American history has its uses on both sides of the cultural divide. However, if you're willing to present some parts of the lives of early Americans as admirable and worthy of imitation, you reveal much on where you draw the line. There's a certain intellectual dishonesty in quoting the Mayflower Compact, finding the roots of modern Thanksgiving in the Plymouth Plantation, and then quietly ignoring the mass murder of Pequots just a few years later. One of early America's most prominent preachers and theologians, Cotton Mather, was not shocked by the massacre of hundreds of men, women, and children. He did not peer into the Gospels for ammunition to condemn wholesale murder. Instead, he noted with some satisfaction that on that day, 600 Indian souls had, quote, been sent down into hell, where they belonged. You know, murderous land grabs as a faith-based enterprise. No doubt early New Englanders were frightened of Indian reprisal. They really believed their lives were on the line, and they had to do everything to defend themselves. But these early American Christians also exhibited an all too human failing, a failing exhibited by societies of every religion, in every age, in every corner of the world. They denied the humanity of their enemies in order to make killing them easier. Because the Pequots, the Wampanoags, and many of the other tribes hunted to near extinction were not Christian, they failed to meet a baseline test for our compassion. For many early Americans, religious life was a loosely structured and episodic affair. Popular preachers were the pop stars of their era before mass communications and easy transportation. Meetings in clearings and barns resembled high school battle of the bands competitions, with traveling preachers shouting their best stuff in front of enthusiastic crowds hungry for stimulation and news of the outside world. Then, as now, the religious life of Americans was one of stunning contrasts and bewildering variety. The largely self-taught preachers of the slave quarters kept the hope of freedom alive with the promises of the Psalms and the liberation of Israel. There's a funny paradox in trying to understand America's Christian roots and whether, and how they lead us to the yeasty diversity and bitter debates of today. In 18th century America, church attendance was very low compared to today. Yet any literate person knew the Bible well, both Hebrew Scripture and New Testament. Even the semi-literate and illiterate knew whole hunks of the Bible by heart, the Psalms, the Beatitudes, the foundational stories of Adam and Eve, Job, the Passion of Jesus. While today, with the highest levels of church attendance in the wealthy world, one of the highest self-declared rates of God belief in all the world, scriptural illiteracy is widespread. I've already mentioned the revealing assignment of God helps those who help themselves to Scripture instead of to poor Richard. But even as the battles over Ten Commandments monuments in courthouses and nailed to schoolhouse walls reached the nation's highest court, a sizable majority of Americans can't name the laws handed to Moses on Sinai, even if you spot them 50 points and tell them they can name them out of order. Both Christian conservatives and die-hard secularists agree that the landscape began to change with a series of Supreme Court decisions that made American public schools more secular places. With the election of John Kennedy in 1960 that opened the most exclusive doors in American power to America's largest religious group, and affirming consensus around a neutral, deist civil religion that tried to include most American believers in very general affirmations of faith that involved no statements of real sectarian conviction. One of the most well-known American politicians of that day was the governor of New York, often discussed as a presidential candidate, Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller used to travel across the country and, of course, across New York State and refer to the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. Who could be upset about that? The brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. Of course, the reporters that covered Rocky heard that so often that they used to just write down in their reporters' notebooks, bomb fog, to cover this oft-repeated phrase. In those days, high public officials mentioned God from time to time, but they never had to flesh out the meaning of those statements in any real detail. The pushback began with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968 and the candidacy of George Wallace, continued with Jimmy Carter's election in 1976, and was cresting with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. These events are major chapters in the story of the realignment of American politics and in the story of the religionization of our politics at the same time. The Southern strategy helped the Republican Party phase in Southern whites feeling disaffected and betrayed by the Democratic Party during the civil rights years, paving the way for an increasingly Republican South. The election of Jimmy Carter brought in Southern and other evangelicals into the electoral spotlight. After decades of suspicion of politics and elections, decades during which this huge block of citizens had not punched their weight in American elections. Now a candidate who spoke their language, mirrored their concerns in his own, and spoke openly, publicly, in a newly detailed way about personal faith and its attachment to public life, was asking for their support to go to the White House, and he got it. The Carter campaign mobilized these voters, but then alienated them. If you look at the approval ratings and the margin of loss in 1980, you might conclude that most Americans felt let down by the Carter administration, but this particular block of white, non-urban, middle and working class evangelicals were now energized, identified, organized, and became a target of opportunity for the surging Republican Party in 1980. Along with lingering anger over the Civil Rights Acts 15 years earlier, dismay over abortion after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision was used as a potent organizing tool. But add to that backlash against a secularized popular culture and the sexualization of that culture, a disdain for public schooling, public assistance, almost anything with the word public in it. And you've got religion gradually operating as a terrific sorting mechanism, a shorthand for determining who's like us, who's my kind of American, and who isn't. In big slices of America, but especially in the suburbanizing and modernizing South and West. I mourn the day when smart political operatives figured out that religion could be used in this way, not because I don't think a religious faith can bring a person to convictions about how the world ought to be, not because I believe that religion has no place in shaping common wisdom, creating common cause, and having us carry those values to the voting booth. Nothing could be further from the truth. But to tell the story of how this country became the most powerful country in history can't be told without the story of American religious conviction, religious inventiveness, new ways of being both Christian and American. But just as that is true, you can't tell the story of America without a secular storyline as well. Of Tom Paine and Tom Jefferson, of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Susan B. Anthony, and Mark Twain, who cherished this country's watershed decision to separate its religion from its electoral politics, its religious treasuries from the public purse, and stepped back from giving Christianity the overwhelming majority religion from the very first days of this country some special or exalted legal status, as it has right through to today in many Western democracies, where, incidentally, the churches are empty. Those two meta-narratives, the religious and the secular, entwined through 200 years of history, from the salons of Boston and Philadelphia to the tent meetings of early Ohio, Kentucky, and Illinois, from Joseph Smith's Palmyra, New York, to Fray Junipero Serra's California missions, to Thorstein Veblen's lecture halls, to Thoreau's cabin at Walden, from Jane Addams' Hull House to Dorothy Day's soup kitchens and manual training classrooms. America's tremendous inventiveness, drive, fruitful conflict, its unshielded, noisy muffler throwing off sparks to light 200 years of tinder, is an inheritance that we owe to believers of every stripe, and skeptics, freethinkers, and atheists of every stripe. But a winner-take-all mentality has soaked into American religion, a mentality that it may have picked up like a bad cold from hanging around politicians so much. One strain of American Christianity has melded itself to the state and created a kind of Christian Americanism, which conflates belief in Jesus with the belief in the unassailable rightness and goodness in world affairs, with the idea of America as a chosen nation, with a mission in the world that is godly, which carries embedded in it the notion that non-Christian or secular nations are somehow less valuable, less good, less noble than our own. It's a far cry from the Baptist disdain for both government and politics that held them both to be flawed creations of men, prone to compromise, corner-cutting, and temptation. Today, even leaders on the inside, who are welcomed into the highest councils of government, aren't sure they're making a bargain with the powerful and the partisan that they're going to be so glad to keep. Some have wondered to me whether they're still able to speak prophetic truth to the powerful after they've allowed their churches to become part of the voter identification and get out the vote efforts of one particular political party. Now let me be very, very clear about something. Do not think for a second that I'm taking sides in the partisan debates of the day, that I think one party is right and the other one is wrong, that one party has reliably good answers while the others are reliably poor. There are no white hats and black hats in my story, as much as an exposition of how flawed religion is as a policy-making tool, and how it leads us to places we probably don't expect. The very notion of what a government is has been under assault in the last 30 years. It's no longer a shared creation, something we own and operate together and for each other. Instead, it's something that gets seized in the view of some activists, by a confessional majority to be run according to the wishes of that majority to benefit the benighted minorities, bringing them benefits whether they want them or not. In this elbows-out, rough game of seizing the government for righteous reasons, the majority first presents itself as a persecuted minority, deprived of the basic rights of citizenship by an abusive and hostile elite. Every initiative that doesn't square with their specific desires is called anti-Christian, anti-people of faith, and that term can be used with a very broad brush indeed, as we saw in a series of Justice Sunday programs organized by Republican elected officials and large evangelical organizations to rouse the base. Since the judicial nominees opposed by many senators for a variety of reasons were also Christian conservatives, the two attributes were neatly elided to become one unified single accusation: that members of the Judiciary Committee oppose these judicial nominees because they are people of faith. That was the headline of urgent news releases sent to evangelical churches across the country, that the Democratic members of the Senate Judiciary Committee would not grant a hearing or an up-and-down vote to judicial nominees because they were members of conservative Christian denominations or because they were Roman Catholic. So suddenly the fight was removed from politics, where people disagree with each other for political reasons, and moved into churches. The fight over the Ten Commandments in the top courthouse in Alabama, the fight in a rural Delaware county over the use of Christian prayers in public schools, all stem from the surging political self-confidence of a once dormant political force in this country, flexing its muscle and challenging the civic religious consensus of those post-war decades. Must a public school serve the particular religious tastes of a majority of parents? After all, they are a majority, and a majority of the taxpayers who pay to keep and maintain and operate those schools. Why shouldn't their voice be heard? Well, suddenly we're having debates again in the early 20th century that we haven't had for 50 and 60 years. Should a kid who's a member of a minority religion just suck it up and understand that he or she lives in a majority Christian country? Or should the idea of a public school include the notion that while your house and your church are realms set apart, ideological free fire zone to believe what you wish and preach what you wish, the things we operate in common, our courts, our schools, our legislatures, are, down to their very DNA, conceived with a different idea about who and what the public is in 21st century America. The battles over these questions have become so heated and so angry and so personal that common sense, that reasonable person standard applied in so many court cases, can no longer be relied upon to prevail. Maybe because I grew up in a stunningly diverse religious scene in Brooklyn, New York, of Jews across the spectrum from the totally secular to those still wearing the clothing of 18th century Eastern European towns, of Roman Catholics from Latin America and Europe, Scandinavian Lutherans and African American Protestants, all the way from high church Anglican Barbadians to storefront missionary Baptists. We all carried with us, we Brooklynites, little expectation that we could remake the world in our desired religious image if only we could grab hold of the control panels of government by winning elections. Jews knew at some point in February or early March, suddenly a lot of people around them would have a black cross on their foreheads as they ran to the subway or grabbed a quick coffee at a takeout counter. Catholics knew there'd be several days in the fall, it seemed to happen on slightly different days, when their Jewish neighbors would be eating out on their fire escapes or in the backyard or under a contraption of bamboo poles and plastic ivy. Now add to that mix tens of thousands of Hindus and Buddhists, thousands more non-believers, and more families with intergenerational lack of religious affiliation. Not just two parents with no active religious life, but two parents and 4 grandparents and 5 out of 8 great-grandparents. People who have simply chosen not to partake in the amazing American religious smorgasbord, who also don't think that should compromise their place in the life of a citizen. One of the more repulsive aspects of using religion as a political sorting mechanism is how easily it conforms to the already deep-seated notions that we carry around in our heads, adding religious fertilizer to the already well-rooted weed in American thought that people from certain places, with certain beliefs and certain ways of life, are more American, more genuinely American than others. One of the great gifts of American life is that we don't base belonging on blood, clan, color, national origin, time in country, or any combination of the above. People who live on a farm or in an exurban area are not any more American or any more the possessors of American values than people who live in cities. People who live in Nebraska itself aren't any more American than people who live on Nebraska Avenue in Washington, D.C. People who are evangelical Protestants are not more American than people who are Roman Catholics, Jews, or Muslims. The more you infuse religion into debates about lawmaking and policy, the more you leave combatants at a debate disadvantage they wouldn't necessarily have strictly on the merits. What I mean by that is, once you say you support one side of an argument because that's the way God wants it, where do you leave the other side? Able only to say, "Oh no, it's not"? That immediately converts a public policy dispute into a theological one. Or how many are ready to risk much greater peril with what might even be the correct answer: what God wants is not the issue here. It makes for bad debate. It may make for bad law. It can easily make for lazy law, popular with a highly motivated constituency, but not really crafted with the greatest good for the greatest number in mind. But we join these debates passionately nonetheless. For instance, religiously inspired groups worked hard to keep a vaccine for human papillomavirus out of general distribution. Now, HPV is sexually transmitted. It can be a precursor infection in women to uterine cancer. But religious groups with the ear of a new generation of recently appointed drug and health authorities maintained that the availability of the vaccine would encourage people to be promiscuous. I don't know. Maybe it would. There are legions ready to argue both sides of that issue and amass their social science and research piles of documents on both sides of the table and duke it out. But is the core mission of a public health agency that is an arm of the government of a secular republic, the FDA, to prevent disease or police people's sex lives? Many of the people who want to infuse our government with more religious-based public policy say that it's not only legitimate to want that, but part of the normal and healthy functioning of a democracy. If they motivate more people to want that kind of lawmaking to go out and vote than those who are strict separationists, it's not only a legitimate but desirable outcome. It's an outcome that rewards organized voting blocs that successfully use the ballot to gain power and influence, goes the argument. Just as it would be, evangelicals add, if their opponents won and immediately waved through emergency contraception, Plan B, immediately waved through HPV virus vaccines, immediately waved through the distribution of condoms in high schools. Is that really it? Is that really how we carry on this argument? Does the government belong to the winners or does it belong to everyone? Is it simply a matter of swinging the pendulum in the other direction? If you don't like the direction it's swinging this year? The rising power of religious politics has left winners who complain about being oppressed and losers who say the sky is falling. And the paradoxes don't end with both sides seeing themselves losing in the debates over the religious involvement in politics. Through the entire time this book was researched and written, the United States was involved in a war half a world away that our leaders told us could be a long one, in countries split over how big a role religion should play in their new constitutional orders. It was part of the debate in Afghanistan. It continues to be part of the debate in Iraq. All around the world, religion has moved in to fill a vacuum created by the failure of politics. And America has been caught off guard by this trend. Religious extremism was not the natural state of things in Algeria, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Indonesia. Once upon a time, these countries were among the leaders of the non-aligned movement, a secularizing confederation that offered itself as a counterweight to the two giants facing off in the Cold War. It was the countries of those convinced secularists, atheists even, Tito of Yugoslavia, Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, that have since faced the ferocious backlash of their own religious citizens. As Orthodox Christians fight Catholics and Muslims fight Christians of both stripes in the former Yugoslavia. As a low-grade civil war goes on in Algeria because religious parties are not able to participate in the politics there. In Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim nation, Al-Qaeda allies are eating away at the traditional relaxed brand of Islam, taking advantage of the festering resentments suppressed by decades of authoritarian leadership that did not allow religious freedom and did not allow the voice of faith to be heard in the political debates of the nation. The United States has never needed political Christianity because it guaranteed religious freedom, had no established church, and was fortunate enough to have self-repairing, operational political institutions. This allowed most people, most of the time, to live without fear of the state. Most Americans could live their lives in some confidence that no matter how personally powerless they may be in absolute terms, there would be no knock on the door in the middle of the night. Religion became a beacon for the oppressed. Israel's liberation from Egypt comforted the black church before emancipation, and that story also provided inspiration and comfort for the next century to undergird the struggle for civil rights. Religious faith has sustained Americans in struggle and distress, in loss and victory, spurring them to sacrifice and to care for their fellow human being on the one hand, and sometimes blinding them to great and enduring sin on the other. To borrow a page from Abraham Lincoln, both workers and mill and mine owners who had them beaten and shot prayed to the same God. And as Lincoln said, it was unlikely both sets of prayers were answered. Both Mexican Catholics and the American Protestants who ordered and coordinated the invasion of their country on false pretenses prayed to the same God. Bull Connor and Medgar Evers prayed to the same God. A loudly proclaimed faith, it turns out, is no guarantee of righteousness. As surely as having no faith at all is no guarantee that your cause or your belief is wrong. I would hope American religion would make the religious in this country better people, and that better people would make for better neighborhoods, counties, states, and a better country. And that the people who simply want to follow the golden rule without following an unseen deity or a charismatic preacher would be confidently expected to make the places they live better as well. When we come together to run the places we live, Would we be best served by running things according to religious teaching, or from the idea that the government that does the best it can, achieves the best outcomes for the greatest number of people, is the best government? Many of the religious secular divides around local and state government have to do with messages being sent, with symbolism and hidden meanings, rather than with effectively completing the task at hand. When emergency contraception became a hard-fought skirmish, a proxy war in the abortion battle, what were we accomplishing? Will a woman who cannot get emergency contraception and instead has an abortion be furthering some kind of goal? Will a woman whose birth control fails and cannot easily get emergency contraception and instead bears a child she does not want increase the amount of goodness in the world? Is it preferable to have that same woman seek a surgical abortion 2 months later if the path is blocked to emergency contraception? If you don't approve of emergency contraception for religious values, for religious reasons, do you live out that value by refusing to use it yourself, or by joining the battle to make sure that no one can use it? This is where the rubber meets the roads in our debates today. The women who take Plan B are not pregnant. Some may become pregnant, but they aren't pregnant, and they don't want to be pregnant. As in so many of the debates that currently center on hot social questions like this one, it's at its core a question of whether your religious convictions guide your behavior, guide your life, and influence the lives of others around yours, or if you understand that your duty as a citizen is to make it impossible for those who don't share your faith to make different decisions, because what's right is right no matter what the context. And you wouldn't allow other crimes to go on just because you believe they're a crime and others don't. That's sort of a thumbnail distillation, the essentials of a lot of our debates today. It's the centerpiece of church-state separation battles, public funding for religious entities questions, personal moral questions with governmental and regulatory implications, medical ethics questions that involve the state. For instance, as we saw most notably in the terrible death of Terry Schiavo, end-of-life decisions. They involve deep convictions on the parts of all the combatants. And so far, the way we've used religion to settle them has been both messy and ineffective. Public policy needs to be testable, to be challengeable, to be open to revisiting. Law made with the Bible as a handbook promises to be none of these things, since part of the appeal that religion brings to life is that it speaks to values that are unchanging, unlikely to sway with the wind or change with the next election. A public official may be made to prove that an idea works, but he or she could never prove that a measure is desirable because it conforms with God's law, or even that God exists in the first place. What we want from government and what we want from religion are two different things, and they are, it would seem to me, very different ways of seeing the world and being in the world. I will not support a government that asks me to believe in its effectiveness even when I can't see it. But I revere a master who says that those who believe without seeing are especially blessed. And I manage to do it without my head blowing up on my shoulders. And I think you can too. Thanks a lot for having me with you.
Thank you very much, Ray. We want to open the floor for questions. Let me see, is there a mic out here?
Yeah, there's the mic.
Okay, good. And with one request, please keep it brief and end with a question mark.
You know what that is. Your voice goes up a little bit at the end and it sounds like a question. Yeah, go ahead.
I find it a little ironic that you preach against politics from the pulpit. But my question is, I've often heard people refer to our founding fathers as the basis for bringing religion into politics. And I'm wondering if in your research you've been able to establish any consensus among the founding fathers.
It's a great question. There was a rhetorical style among educated 18th century people that used commonly understood and cultural common currency items as touch points, as points of reference. So even some of the least religious among the founders and theorists of the New Republic used religious allusions and religious imageries in their written and spoken work. This is often mistaken for personal religious conviction. Having said that, my mailbox filled up after my book tour with really some incredibly angry letters. People who were, you could almost see the spittle on the pages as they were writing, who insisted both, A, that the Founding Fathers were all atheists, and how dare you hint that there was religious influence in their thinking when it came to creating a just state, and B, the Founding Fathers were all Christians, and how dare you imply any of them were atheists. Basically, people embrace the model that they like better. But the historical record would indicate that there was a mix of 18th century sons of the Enlightenment, deists, people who believed in the watchmaker model of God, who created the world and then walked away to let it tick-tock away, and a personal God who was involved in the daily lives of human beings. Even Ben Franklin, the head of the American Philosophical Association and known to be a skeptic, someone who in writing doubted the divinity of Jesus, also wrote of the deliberations and said in the councils of the drafting of the Constitution, questioned how a God who knows when a sparrow falls from a tree could not be taking an interested hand in their deliberations at such an important moment. Different George Washingtons emerge from the pens of different historians, some who note with some significance that he was a vestryman in his local Episcopal church, others who point out that any man of property in the community, and someone as important as as influential as George Washington in that community, just south of what's now Washington, D.C., along the Potomac River, would be a warden of the church as much as a civic duty as a religious one, because the operation of the church, which also had lands and property interests and civic interests to look after, was as much a civic function as it was a theological one. So it's still very much contested terrain, but I think it's fair to say that there were Orthodox believers, fairly conventional and serious believers in the various denominations represented in the Continental Congress, people who were sons of the Enlightenment, deists, atheists, and people who just weren't saying. And they all helped make the handbook for the longest continuing operating political order in the world a reality. So why can't we all just relax and spread the credit around a little bit.
Thank you, Roy. By the way, I really enjoy everything you do on PTS and public television. It's a great team you've got there, and Jim Lair someday is going to step down. I sure would like to see you help take over the responsibility. But just a question that I've had over the last 10, 15 years. I'm 74 years old now, by the way, so I've got a little history behind me. I know what it was like back in the 50s. I know what it was like in World War II. But my question nowadays, and it's been bothering me now for at least the last 10, 15 years, do we want a free society? And if we do, I wish some people would tell me how I need to pray to God or what I need to do. I think I'm a pretty good Christian. I don't need their advice. And if you've got something that would help me understand what's bothering me so much, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer a question like that, frankly. But we have been fighting with each other as a people over the definition of freedom since we've been a people, since we've been a polity. So it's not a bad thing or a reflection of weakness when we continue to argue over where the boundaries of freedom are, but a reflection of our strength, I'm convinced. We have, as I mentioned during my talk, in a way unique among societies on earth, self-repairing and self-revisiting political institutions. That's why our Constitution has, 26, 27 amendments. Because we built into the design of our government the idea that as we need to from time to time, we would go back and redefine the broad principles set out in our founding document. So the idea of freedom is one that has always tended to widen. The great tendency over 218 years since the drafting of the Constitution has been to constantly widen the franchise. And sometimes it took out-and-out war on battlefields. Sometimes it took struggles in the ballot box. Sometimes it took chaos, social tumult on the streets of our country to push that definition of what freedom is wider and wider. Just as we engaged in that argument over whether it applied to people of all races and then to people of all genders, now we're engaged in a series of test battles around the country, court cases, ballot measures, about whether it applies to people of all sexual orientations. The battle's not over. It's not clear who's going to prevail. I do watch with some interest the polling numbers, and while a majority of Americans still don't favor finding some sort of legal definition for gay unions in local law, the number that is against it is gradually declining. It is highest among people who are oldest and lowest among the people who are youngest. Now, looking at a model like that, you might have to conclude that eventually the social consensus will change in a way that will lead to finding some sort of legal definition for gay unions that we can live with as a society. Interestingly, when I was doing an interview with Dr. Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention, we first met over the phone, and he says, "Well, I can't see you, so I can't tell how old you are. But I can tell you that never in your lifetime will there be gay marriage in this country, widely accepted." And I said, "Well, never is a long time, Dr. Land. I don't know." And, my own feelings on the subject are quite beside the point and quite immaterial. I think never is a kind of long time, and really looking at the numbers, I don't know if I don't know if we're both going to make it to never on that one. It really is looking like a long struggle for gay people who are looking for those kind of rights, and one that will not result in a kind of binary victory or defeat. It's not going to be like a long struggle that you then win or lose and then it's over. It's more like a 50-round boxing match with test cases going up through the appeals courts in different states and then heading to federal levels and then being sent back down and going to ballot measures and some counties bolting and doing things on their own until a state court makes them stop. And, it's going to be fascinating and it's going to be very long, and I don't know how it ends, but it looks like that's the sort of latest chapter in another group of Americans saying, well, we want a definition of freedom that includes our freedom as well. Yes, sir.
I'm an 80-year-old still practicing OBGYN physician, so I'm particularly interested in your comments about reproduction and religion, but my question will not be in that realm. What I'd like to bring up is the fact that in 1928, Al Smith, who was unacceptable to the Bible Belt Protestant, South, was defeated. And 30 years later, John Kennedy, it was considered, could he run for president and be elected because he was a Roman Catholic, and the issue was brought up at that time. And now the strange bedfellows of the evangelical Christians and the Roman Catholics are now commonly bonded under the label of being conservative. But my question is, would you comment on the fact that 5 members of the Supreme Court, 5 out of 9 members are Roman Catholic, and that issue, to my knowledge, was never brought up in the process of selecting them?
Well, you're right. For the first time in American history, a majority of members of the Supreme Court are members of the Roman Catholic Church. It's really a remarkable march of an American group from living in this country under a high degree of suspicion. Look back at the nativist parties, the know-nothings. Look back at the terrible propaganda, scurrilous cartoons and handbills and tracts that were handed out questioning the loyalty of Roman Catholic citizens to the United States. And it is just an amazing thing that now, 160 years after the potato famine and the revolutions of 1848, which sent lots of Germans and Irish Catholics toward these shores, and here we are with a majority of the Supreme Court of Roman Catholic. Now, given the mix of issues that are heading the court's way, it is going to be interesting to watch. But it wasn't all that long ago that your religious affiliation wouldn't have been considered to be able to tell us much about your political convictions. So, Joe McCarthy was a Roman Catholic too, and he was in the same ethnic and religious background as John Kennedy, but nobody would say that Joe McCarthy and John Kennedy had anything in common politically. All kinds of people had all kinds of beliefs on all kinds of major divisive issues of the day across the long cavalcade of American history. So I think it would be a mistake to assume that the members of the United States Supreme Court are going to be that way. Now, often when there are 7-2 decisions in the court lately, the 2 are Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia, who both happen to be Roman Catholic. But in 5-4 decisions, they tend, when they find themselves in the 4, in the 5 is Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's also a Roman Catholic. So I wouldn't try to overread that, but it is going to be interesting when such things as use of public facilities by religious groups, tax-exempt status for religious entities, the diverting of public school funds to help fund religious schools, and these various issues come up before the court. The last two confirmed members of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Samuel Alito, are both Roman Catholics, and try to, I think, in an admirable way, give a fairly non-sectarian view of what the Constitution requires of Supreme Court justices. So I'm not. This doesn't worry me at all. I think it's an interesting historical development, but stay tuned. It's going to be really exciting. I mean, right-to-life cases are coming up, contraception cases, cases involving equal employment laws and religious-based charities and religious-based social service agencies and their ability to hire and fire whom they choose based on sectarian considerations. So there are a lot of questions that certainly involve the Roman Catholic Church that will be coming before a now Catholic majority court. It's going to be an interesting time. Yes, ma'am.
I've appreciated PBS' attention to Madeleine Albright's book, The Mighty and the Almighty, to John Danforth's approach, and I've wondered if the three of you have ever served on a panel, and does the reading of those three books complement some key issues?
Well, when Secretary Albright's book came out, she suggested that she and I go on book tour together, but since we have two different publishers, nothing ever came of it. When I made a book appearance in Bethesda, Maryland, John Danforth came, and it was quite a, I looked up from my text, and there he is, the guy who wrote the same book that came out the same month. So it was good to see him there. And to show you what a mensch John Danforth is, while he was writing his book, I called him up for an interview for my book because he had just written that op-ed piece in the New York Times criticizing the Republican Party for its new religious direction. And instead of saying, hey, Ray, I'd love to talk to you, but I'm writing a book on the same subject right now, and so I'd rather not, which was totally within his right to do so, being a decent guy, he never said a thing. He just scheduled the interview, and we talked for an hour, and I quote him in the book, and then, lo and behold, out comes his book on many of the same topics. But his, of course, is written from a very specific partisan point of view and written from a very specific religious point of view, since he's an ordained person. So our books are similar, but not exactly the same. Though, coincidentally, John Danforth, Madeleine Albright, and I are all Episcopalians. Make of that what you wish.
We want to thank Ray Suarez very much for his visit and talk here at Vanderbilt. Before we break, I want to call your attention to two other featured lectures sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and Culture. Coming up on April 11th at 6 o'clock here in the chapel, Reverend James Lawson will be addressing the topic, Moving Ourselves from Unknown Peril to Noble Vision. And then at the beginning of May 4th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's a Friday, Christoph Koch, who was here for two lectures this last week, will be returning for his final lecture, generally on the topic of neuroscience and religion. Thank you very much, Ray, and I want to invite all of you to a reception. If you go through to your left or to your right, you'll find the lounge there, Tillet Lounge, and we've got a lot of food. Please join us. Thank you.